Okay, yeah, here he is, take him. One Thanos coming right up, today on 3DIY. Welcome back to 3DIY, the 3D printing show with more cheese than a lasagna, but it's good cheese. Before we get started with the build this week, I have a confession to make. I've been using rub and buff wrong.
Oh, hey, that's a sex thing.
Uh-huh. So rub and buff is...
that's a sex thing.
Can we get this all out of our system before we start the video here? I'm going to be saying the word rub and buff a lot.
Oh, just like a sex thing.
Oh, is it?
I've been told.
Okay, now that that's out of our systems. Rub and buff is this... comes in this neat little tube. And what it is it's this magnificent, easy to use metallic finish that comes in like it's not really paint, but it's sort of like a wax and alcohol mixture. And it's well known in the cosplay and prop making community because it's really effective at making a fast and really convincing metallic finish. Today on the show, I'd like to atone for my past sins with rub and buff and show you how to use it to make this nice metallic finish on this Thanos sculpture I got from @Östman on myminifactory.com. Before we get started on that though, you know it's time for a 3D printing montage. My goodness, this model is just gorgeous. I just love the detail that Östman puts into this thing. And what we're going to do today is we're going to make that pop with a metallic finish, which is inspired by how he likes to finish his models, which I saw over on his Instagram post. I think he uses a resin printer to get quality like this, so I'm not quite going to hold myself to that standard. But I'm going to make something that I'm really proud of. Okay, first things first. This is a purple print. And while that is fitting for Thanos, I actually considered leaving his skin parts unpainted for a hot minute there, but decided against it. We are going to need a little base coat. Now for something like this, I would probably be inclined to use my airbrush, but since I know not everybody is able to afford an airbrush / has one readily available, I thought I would show that you don't necessarily need one by painting on the base coat with just a paintbrush. Alright, now that the base coat is dry, it's time for the fun part, the rub and buff.
That's a sex thing.
I thought you said you would leave. In the past with rub and buff, my cardinal sin, so I'm calling it, has been applying it with a paintbrush. And while that is sort of effective, and let's take a step back here, I don't actually want to condemn anyone using art materials in any way other than how they were intended. This method I used with the paintbrush did work. It was effective, and I would do it again. But from a tutorial perspective, I'd like to show you here the quote-unquote proper way to do it. See, rub and buff gets its name from its application process. So what I like to do is I get either a cloth, or in this case just a nitrile glove, and just using the smallest bits at a time, just kind of rub it right into the surface, just with your finger. And right away you can see just how much that transfers the pigment right onto the model. It's really quite effective. Now, if this were a smooth model, which this isn't quite, it has some ridges since I didn't do any post-processing, the rub and buff would actually go a lot farther. The reason that I have to use more on something like this with the ridges is because it has lots of extra surface area and grooves to hide the rub and buff in, so it doesn't freely slide around the surface quite as well as it would on, say, metal or a well-sanded, smoothed print. So a little extra elbow grease is going to be necessary for this one. And it's just a matter of patience and just rubbing and buffing, as it were. Now you notice that I don't worry too much about getting rub and buff in the deep crevices, and that's because that will just contribute to the depth of the weathering effect that I'm going to do afterwards. Okay, now that we've applied all of the rub and buff, it's time to do some weathering. Now, I'm not strictly sure if this step was necessary, But before I get to the weathering, I'd like to protect this coat of Rub and Buff to make sure that the oil-based paints I'll be using don't mess with the finish. I'll be using this Krylon Triple Thick Crystal Clear Glaze spray, and just put a couple of nice thick coats of that on to get a nice shiny glossy finish that will be protected against the weathering paint. Now the final step is weathering. For most of my previous builds on the show, I've used a water and acrylic paint mixture for my weathering, but today on the show I'd like to show you something different. What I have here are water mixable oil paints, and these are preferable to acrylic paints in a couple of different ways. First of all, they don't stain the surface of your model quite as quickly as acrylic paints do. See, if you are overzealous with your acrylic painting, sometimes you can leave just kind of what looks like a wet stain, and oil paints don't really have that problem because of their extremely extended dry time. They're really easy to wipe off and manipulate while they're still on the surface of the print. Now that reason alone is enough to like it, but I especially like the realism that oil paint affords because oil is a real type of grime that gets built up in armor and on metal. You know, it's a real type of grime, and so it just adds an extra level of realism over acrylic paint, and I really dig that. I'd like to give a shout out to Bill Duran over at Punished Props for teaching me this method because it rocks. Thanks, Bill. In every other way, this is exactly the same as using an acrylic wash though. So if you don't have access to water mixable oils, feel free to just use water and acrylic. It'll work almost as well. First, I'll use a mixture of flat black and water and just wash that all over, and that'll be my nice deep dark crevice colors. And then for some extra dimension and a little bit more of a realistic dirt effect, since, you know, dirt isn't just black, I'll also go over it with another wash in burnt umber. Now, the one thing that you do need to know about oil paints is that they will take a long time to dry, somewhere in the ballpark of 2 days to dry. So you're not going to want to handle your model too much in this period while the paint is still drying. And you'll know, it'll feel, well, oily. But once he's had sufficient time for the paint to dry, my Rub and Buff metallic Thanos bust is complete. And that's about it for this episode of 3DIY. I'm super happy with how this thing turned out. I didn't do any post-processing or sanding or anything, and I like the way that the print lines give it this kind of brushed metal sort of look. All in all, I'm really happy with it. Obviously, his gross nutsack of a chin and stupid face freaked me the fuck out, but that just speaks volumes to the quality of the artist who created this model. It's just fantastic. Before you go, don't forget to snap that like button, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new here. I've got new videos coming out every week or so with cool stuff like this, so stay tuned. And if you want to go the extra mile and support the show, you can head on over to our Patreon, where you can find all kinds of perks, like downloading 3D models that I make on the show, and joining in our Discord server and having a say in what we make next year. That's all for now. Stay creative, you nerds.